talked about the geopolitical conditions of the last days. Tonight we talk about, I've got the wrong one up, Kenny. You got the right one up, I got the wrong one up. We're going to talk about the geological conditions of the last days, and also a little bit about the cosmological, so the things related to the earth and things related to what we call the universe. So Matthew 24 we've been using as our roadmap. This is the Olivet Discourse. And Jesus has told the disciples that the day is coming, and I'm paraphrasing, that no stone will be left on top of another in which the temple has been built. The temple is going to be completely leveled to the ground. And the disciples understood this to be a declaration of the end of the world. So they asked Jesus in verse number 3, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" And Jesus answered and said unto them, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." And we used that as our text, as well as verse number 11 and 24 as representative of the spiritual conditions of the last days. In verse 6, "Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." And we used that as our text for last week in the geopolitical conditions, along with verse 32, where the parable of the fig tree is given, and that represents the rebirth of Israel in unbelief, which was fulfilled on May 14th, 1948. So tonight, for the geological conditions and the cosmological conditions, we have, first of all, the last part of verse number 7, which says, "And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places." And then the parallel passage in Luke 21, verse 11 and 25 says this, "And great earthquakes." That's that high magnitude variety we mentioned in our prophecy news segment. "And great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilences." But Luke adds this, "And fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven." Luke 21:25, "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars. And upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." So that is the text that represents our discussion, at least in the first hour, maybe also our second hour tonight, the geological and cosmological conditions of the last days. So let's start with the geological or earth-based conditions. And as the text indicates, referring to famines, pestilences, earthquakes, these represent natural disasters. And natural disasters, like we mentioned last week about war, has been part of human history ever since sin entered into the world. But as we mentioned with war, in the context in which it's mentioned here in Luke 24, where in verse number 8 it says, "All these," including famines, pestilences, earthquakes, "are the beginning of sorrows." That word sorrow there is the same word translated as travail, birth pangs elsewhere. So these things are like the labor pains of a woman who's pregnant. She's about ready to have her baby. And those labor pains increase in their frequency and in their intensity the nearer the woman comes to actual delivery. So in this regard, the second coming of Christ is like a childbirth. And the closer we get to Jesus' physical return to planet Earth to set up his 1,000-year kingdom, these things, all these things are going to increase in their frequency and their intensity. So let's look at them. Very briefly, let's look at famines. 2/3 of the worst famines in recorded history, 2/3, occurred during the 20th century. Remember, last week we mentioned that the 20th century was dubbed the century of war because upwards of 175 million people lost their lives as a direct result of war during the 20th century. Well, famine took the lives of 122 million during the 20th century. And the table we have up on the screen there shows you the worst famines during the 20th century. And interestingly enough, these famines occur in nations or regions of the world that have not traditionally been gospel-friendly. Places like China and Russia, India, Korea, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Bangladesh. These are places that historically have been pagan. They've been Islamic, Hindu, communist/atheistic. They're not gospel-friendly. They're also not very Jewish-friendly. The number of nations experiencing food shortages has tripled just in the past 20 years. Today, in 2012, approximately 1/6 of the nations of the world, or about 34 of them, are experiencing a significant shortage of food. Entire nations, in other words, not just parts of the nation, but entire nations are starving to death. Pestilences. Historical outbreaks, and even today, things that could become pandemics include the following: typhoid, cholera, malaria, smallpox, meningitis, Ebola, E. coli. And everyone's familiar with the bubonic plague, or what was known as the Black Death. The Black Death killed 35 million people, which doesn't sound like that much in 21st century terms, but that constituted 1/3 of the entire population of Europe at the time, which was between 13 and 1400 AD. And then everybody's probably heard of the Great Spanish Flu. The Great Spanish Flu of 1918 through 1919, right on the heels of the end of World War I, killed between 50 and 100 million people in just 6 months. So the Black Death of the bubonic plague killed 35 million over a period of a century. The Spanish flu killed 2 to 3 times that amount in just 6 months. And if we put that death toll in contemporary numbers, that would be like 350 million people dying today in 6 months. That's a lot of people dying from the flu. And we've gotten really desensitized to the flu because it's so common. But strains of influenza are mutating all the time. And as they think to have a handle to at least control, not necessarily cure, but control one strain, another one surfaces that they didn't know about. Everyone's familiar with the bird flu, the avian influenza. And it's a very real threat, very, very much a potential pandemic threat. AIDS, or what it used to be called, right? Does anyone remember what it used to be called before it was called AIDS? GRID. Gay-related immune deficiency. And the name was changed for political correctness. But AIDS it's an epidemic in the continent of Africa. And then we have this relatively new thing that's surfaced called flesh-eating disease. Necrotizing fasciitis, I think I'm pronouncing that right. And it just eats away at the limbs of a person. There was a young girl in Georgia who went, what's the term? Over the zip lining, yes, over the river. And the line broke and she fell and gashed her leg, and what should have been simple antibiotics, stitch up the wound, turned into a horror story for her and her family because she contracted this flesh-eating disease. And in this day and age of medicine, we have made tremendous advances in technology and medicine. We'll talk about that in a future lesson, actually. It seems almost inconceivable that we have not gotten a leg up, really, on disease. We've whipped some old foes, that's true. But as one is whipped, two more come up in its place. It's amazing. All right, let's move on to earthquakes, shall we? All right, the chart up here represents the number of earthquakes magnitude 1.0 or greater. And the time span we're looking at is between 1973 and 2008. And the reason why I have such odd dates there is I wanted to make sure to get an exact count by year. By year. Okay? So the information I'm going to be sharing with you on earthquakes comes from two main sources. Number one, the U.S. Geological Survey National Earthquake Information Center. And then the other one is ANSS, I think is the abbreviation for it. You'll see that in just a moment. But one thing I do need to note is that the U.S. Geological Survey, if you go to their website, they're no longer reporting out earthquakes of less than 4.5 magnitude on a global scale anymore. If you want to get numbers on number of earthquakes with a lesser magnitude than 4.5, you're not going to get it there. So that sort of skewed my data set, if you will. I wanted to go from 1970 to 2010 at least, but I couldn't go before 1973 and get annual information, at least not without a lot of bean counting, okay? And I'll share more with you in a moment. And moving forward, same thing. So this information up here shows the number of earthquakes. This is worldwide, magnitude 1.0 or greater, and the Richter scale will actually measure less than 1, but they're listed as no magnitude. I omitted those. Okay? And so what we see is that in 1973, there was 4,528. But in the year 2008, which is 35 years later, which is half of a lifetime, right? If we live to be 70, that's half a lifetime. It increased to 29,855. That is a 559.34% increase. Okay? I am not a math expert, but I believe that's statistically significant. Okay? And so you see the numbers, and you see it graphically depicted. Do you see a trend? It's sharply increasing, isn't it? Just in the past 35 years. Let's take a look at it by decade, lumping up these number of earthquakes by decade, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. The trend is the same. We would expect it to be. But when you look at number of earthquakes by pockets of 10 years at a time, the increase is 478.12% between the decade of the 70s and the decade of the 2000s. From 51,455 in the 70s to over 270,000 in the 2000s. What about those great earthquakes? 7.0 or greater. The number of earthquakes with a magnitude of 7.0 or greater has increased 111% between the decade of the 60s compared to the decade of the 2000s. There was only 72 earthquakes of 7.0 or greater during the decade of the 60s, but the last decade, that number was more than doubled, 152. The current decade, and we're only 21 months into that decade, is on pace to have 182 with a magnitude of 7.0 or greater, 30 more than the previous decade, which is a 20% increase, decade over decade. And that's graphically depicted there. I want you to take a look at those bars down there. I want you to see that between the 1900s and the 1950s, it's pretty stable, isn't it? And then it skyrockets, doesn't it? Something happened just after the middle of the last century that set things in motion, no pun intended. Let's talk about 8.0. These are killer quakes. 8.0. There was only one earthquake with a magnitude of 8.0 or greater during each decade between the 20s and the 50s. In other words, from 1921 to 1930, there was one. From 1931 to 1940, one. From 1941 to 1950, one. Okay? 1951, 1960, one. There were 3 earthquakes with a magnitude of 8.0 or greater during the 60s, 2 during the 70s, and 3 in the 80s. So an uptick, but a consistent one. Then we get to the 90s, and there was a 166 2/3% increase during the 1990s. There were 8 during the decade of 1991 to 2000. Then in the 2000s, it went from 8 to 13. The current decade, again, 21 months in, we're on pace to having 17. Do you see the trend? Look at the bars. They're going through the roof. The earth is shaking. Take a look at the United States. The number of earthquakes in the U.S. increased 610% in a 20-year period. That ought to frighten every American. Something's happening here. In 1990, there was only 1,391 registered earthquakes, 1.0 or greater. But in 2010, there was 8,484. When you lump these earthquakes in 10-year periods of time and compare the 90s to the 2000s, you have a 50% increase from 24,201 to 36,300. So the same trend that's happening worldwide is happening here. We're not exempt. We're not protected. And that protection left during the 90s. See the bar? All right, we mentioned in our Prophecy News segment last week, and again today, that between February 2010 and March 2012, an earthquake of magnitude 7.0 or greater occurred somewhere in the world every 188 to 189 days. It started on February 27, 2010 in Chile with an 8.8 earthquake. Then on September 3, 2010, New Zealand had a 7.0. Then on March 11, 2011, that infamous 9.0 in Japan with the ensuing tsunami. September 15, 2011, a 7.3 struck Fiji. And then March 21st of this year, Mexico had a 7.9. Now, for that trend to continue, as we mentioned, there had to have been a 7.0 or greater on September 25th or 26th of this year, which was just this past week, and there wasn't. However, there was a 7.4 earthquake yesterday in Colombia. And what might be an even more disturbing trend than a 188 to 189 day pattern is this. The Colombian earthquake marked the 5th 7.0 or greater earthquake that's occurred somewhere in the world in just the past 45 days. On August 17, 2012, there was a 7.7 in Russia. On August 27th, just 10 days later, a 7.3 in El Salvador. 4 days later, in the Philippines, there was a 7.6. September 5th, a 7.6 in Costa Rica, and then the Colombian earthquake just this past Sunday, a 7.4. We're just waiting for an 8.0 or greater at this point, aren't we? As we mentioned, the source of this information, National Earthquake Information Center of the U.S. Geological Survey. We have their website there if anybody wants to check the data or look at it yourself for whatever reason, find additional information. and then also the Advanced National Seismic System, ANSS, and their website. And their website's particularly helpful if you're not in a hurry. Because if you go to the link that we have there, it's a query for a database, and you put in the conditions and submit your query, and it'll bring back the response. So, for example, the database goes all the way back to 1898. So if I had the time, and I don't, maybe you all do, but I could, for example, say, all right, plug in 1.0 or greater between January 1st, 1900 to December 31st, 1909. Submit. It'll come back. But then you've got a bean count to get the number. Okay? It can be pretty taxing if you go to 1.0. Now, I did that with the 7.0s and the 8.0s. I did that because it wasn't as laborious. But you see why I started with 1973 now on the 1.0s? Because remember, that was in the thousands. Not going to sit there and count all that. The point's well made, isn't it? Earthquakes have increased significantly. They continue to increase. And don't believe the so-called scientists of our day who try to refute this. They will tell you that the reason why it appears that they're increasing is because we have more sophisticated instruments today. Now, that might be so for your lesser earthquakes, but when we start getting up to 7.0s and 8.0s, people remember those. Okay? When they happen, people know they've happened. And those are increasing as well. Okay? So things are changing. The earth itself is travailing in pain because Jesus is coming back soon. So as to the intensity of earthquakes, the average magnitude itself is increasing significantly, as this graph indicates. You see, while the data points themselves could be scattered, the trend over the course of time, represented by that straight line, is up. And that's just from the past 25 years. Straight up. The average magnitude. Earthquakes are getting stronger. As to the diversity, the text said earthquakes in diverse places, right? A total of 563 different locations have experienced an earthquake of magnitude 4.0 or greater since 2005. And when I say location, I'm not talking about city. I'm talking about what would amount to like a county. Okay. 563 different locations, 4.0 or greater. So it's not just the earth itself and seismic activity, it's also the winds, tornadoes. The number of tornadoes increased 842.29% between 1950 and 2011, from 201 tornadoes to 1,894. Consider this. The greatest number of tornadoes in 1 year, 2011. 1,894. The greatest number of tornadoes in 1 month, 758, in April of 2011. The greatest number of tornadoes in 1 day, 200, on April 27th, 2011. In fact, the tornado system of April 25th through the 28th of 2011, one that we all remember, that's the one that hit Tuscaloosa, Alabama, killing over 300 people in its wake, 32 of them in Tuscaloosa. But that storm system was the largest, costliest, and one of the most deadly ever recorded. That single system produced 358 tornadoes over 21 states. When that happened? Last year. Just last year. The number of tornadoes increased 156.48% between the decade of the 50s and the decade of the 2000s, from 5,211 to 13,365. Our current decade, again, we're just 21 months into that, we're on pace to have 18,909 tornadoes. That's an increase of almost 42% from the last decade and 263% from the decade of the 50s. So it's not just earthquakes, it's tornadoes too. And there it is graphically depicted from 1950 to 2010. Same trend, isn't it? It's like this. Okay, there's the chart by decade. Same trend. That's how she looks. Our source for the tornado data is the Storm Prediction Center. Now we move on to hurricanes. CNN ran an article that indicated that hurricanes aren't behaving like many of us are used to them behaving. They're bigger and meaner, so that's intensity, and more numerous than many people have seen. That's frequency. The number of Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes was relatively consistent between the 50s and the 90s, which I found pretty surprising. When you look at hurricanes, you can't only consider what's in the Atlantic. Okay, you've got Pacific storms as well, typhoons, cyclones. You've got them in the Indian Ocean. They're all over. Okay. But the number between 2001 and 2010 was 64.5% higher than the previous, or from the decade of the 80s, that is. And the chart we have here shows the trend in hurricanes. Again, it's like that. 2011 was the most costly year for natural disasters in history by far. The total number of reported natural disasters, which includes not just hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, but also forest fires, floods, volcanic eruptions, has skyrocketed in the past 40 years, as this chart indicates. You have two lines here. You have the red line at the bottom, which shows the relative increase of earthquakes compared to all disasters, and you see a massive spike in the past 40 years. Something's happening. The earth is groaning and travailing in pain, isn't it? This increase in frequency and intensity is proof we're in the last days, not because I said so. My opinion doesn't count. Jesus said all these, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, great earthquakes, those things, are the beginning of sorrows, the birth pangs. Okay? When you see them, it's like the commencement of the labor pains. So what can we expect of them as we get closer to the coming of the Lord? They increase in frequency and intensity. And the data, the true scientific data, backs that up. And it's just through the roof, isn't it? To the point where you'd be saying, if this was a woman, the baby's on the way. The baby is on the way. All right, let's wrap up by talking a little bit about some cosmological conditions. We read how there be great signs in the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars, and so forth. And quite honestly, I could have given you a lot more evidence along these lines, but I thought the geological evidence was far more compelling. But we'll just give you some examples of some things along the cosmological lines. Back in 1994, the comet Shoemaker-Levy collided with the planet Jupiter. That was a pretty wild thing to behold, as we saw the plume emerge on the surface of the planet Jupiter. Back last year in the month of May, a comet collided with the sun. 2012 through 2013, we're told, is a peak solar cycle for solar flares and what are known as coronal mass ejections, or CMEs. That's been in the news a lot lately, and rightly so. There's a great fear of these CMEs. These things have been very active. They've been very powerful. And the greatest fear, of course, is that if we get one large enough, it's possible that it could create electromagnetic disturbances in our atmosphere that would do more than give us a great aurora borealis show, but could actually mess up the Earth's electromagnetic field, including producing a local, regional, or global electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. Which, if that were to happen, folks, everything electronic is fried, goes out. And just to show how contemporary and apropos this discussion is, one of the major networks, I think it's NBC, has a TV series now called Revolution, I think is what it's called. And what's the premise? A global EMP. And life on Earth 15 years after that event. They still haven't restored the electricity, the power. It's the greatest threat to the United States as far as a form of terror. Okay, probably more so than a nuclear bomb. Because our enemies really don't have the capacity to produce a nuclear weapon that can destroy the entire nation. Not jihadists anyway. Russia certainly has that capability. But getting a weapon of that magnitude into the country is another story. What is far more plausible, though, is to detonate a nuclear weapon or some sort of an EMP device at a high altitude over the continental United States that upon detonation would fry our electro infrastructure. The grid completely is fried. Because then all of our defense warning systems are gone. Our entire infrastructure is gone. Planes fall from the sky. I mean, you name it, folks. And you want to talk about chaos? It's a very real threat. And we don't need terrorists to even do it. Our own sun can do it with one huge coronal mass ejection or flare. Back in March of this year, there was an article out, and it was called Beware the Flare. A Class X solar flare dubbed as a solar tsunami was heading for Earth. Now, fortunately for all of us, it came and it went. It didn't produce an EMP. It didn't really do much damage, but there was a power outage recently, a very large-scale one in the country of India. Did anyone remember hearing about that? Okay. If something like that happened in our country, it would have a massive ripple effect on global economy, food distribution, you name it. Many ancient pagan prophecies, including the Mayans, believe that solar disturbances will cause or at least contribute to the end of the world, the end of this age. We'll talk about the Mayans in a future lesson. This past June, we had the transit of Venus, which is a regular event, but it just doesn't happen that often. It happens in pairs. I think it happens twice every 100 years or so. I'm approximating there. But when it happens, the first time it happens, it's then followed by another occurrence just 7 or 8 years after that. And then there's another 100 years or so. And then it happens again with a gap between them of 7 or 8 years, then another 100 plus years. So this past June 5th and 6th, we saw the transit of Venus where it passed right in front of the surface of the sun. People could see it with protective eyewear or telescope. You could see it. And the same thing had happened about 7 or 8 years earlier. Next time it happens, 2117. Asteroid 2012 DA14, measuring 60 meters in diameter, is expected to come within 16,700 miles of the Earth by February of 2013. To put that in perspective, the distance to the moon is 238,857 miles. All right? So 16,700 miles. Somebody's on our front porch. And that thing's 60 meters. Don't hear much about that. What we do hear a lot about, back and forth, and what it all means is the great galactic alignment that's going to occur on December 21st, 2012, right? At 11:11 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on December 21st, 2012, the Earth and the Sun are going to be completely aligned with the very center of the Milky Way galaxy, and this brings to an end the 13th Baktun on the Mayan calendar and the alleged end of the world as we know it. Or, as some optimists would say, oh, it's not the end of the world. It's like December 31st on your calendar. You take the old one down, you put the new one up. It doesn't mean that your house burned down to the ground. I'm not saying it's the end of the world. I would say it isn't, if you're going to ask my personal opinion, because we're not going to know the day and the hour. Okay? And I know this, Jesus Christ is not coming back to planet Earth on December 31st, 2012, because we're still here. We've got to be gone a minimum of 7 years before he comes back to planet Earth to set up his kingdom. Amen? So I know for certain Jesus Christ is not coming back, so this world will not come to an end on December 31st, 2012. But that doesn't mean something isn't going to happen. I mean, if anything, there could be a great satanic deception that's going to occur on that day. Don't know. Don't know. I said we'll talk more about the whole Mayan thing. We'll have a whole lesson devoted to that. But don't get caught up in that stuff. I mean, that's just the devil's attempt to get our eyes off of the true word of prophecy, this right here. Everything we need to know, we've got right here. Everything. So we don't need stone tablets and cave sketchings and so-called archaeologists and scientists telling us anything about what's to come. God already has. All right, then we have this. We've got a blood red lunar eclipse that's scheduled to occur on the exact dates of the Passover and Feast of Tabernacles, 2 Jewish holy days, in 2014 and 2015. In addition, a solar eclipse is scheduled to occur on September 15th, 2015, the exact date of the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, another Jewish holy day. Why is that so important? Eclipses coinciding with the dates of Jewish holy days will not occur again at all in the 21st century. And it only happened twice in the 20th century, and the dates are significant. The first time was in 1949-1950, a year following Israel's rebirth as a nation. And the other, 1967 and 68, the year that Jerusalem was liberated following the Six-Day War. So the other two occurrences tie directly with years or times associated with the nation of Israel. Very interesting. So we're reminded, Matthew 24, verse 29 through 30, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. And the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Now that there specifically refers to something that will occur during the tribulation, but what we can expect between now and then are prototypes, or dress rehearsals, if you will, of that final fulfillment. So we will see blood red moons, darkened suns, whether it be through an eclipse or some other explainable means. These things will increase in their frequency and intensity, preparing the world for a time that it's going to happen in a way that cannot be explained by any natural means. It's just simply the moon is turning blood red, and the sun, like the Lord just taking the switch and turning her out.